Good afternoon. It has become something of a cliche within human rights circles to talk about the closing space for civil society. But this is not a cliche to activists and civil society organizations who are working in increasingly hostile environments and authoritarian societies. And you're going to hear from those brave people this afternoon. You'll hear about their challenges, but you will also hear about their solutions, their ingenuity, their resolve, and their hope. You will hear that in many ways, the tools of authoritarian leaders have not changed. In too many places still, they include political violence, imprisonment, torture, even extrajudicial killing. But in many ways, the tools have changed. They include more subtle tactics, like propaganda, co-optation of the media, cyber politics, bringing shame and disrepute upon organizations, infiltrating their operations. Actions like this hit us particularly hard as an AIDS movement. We are a movement born in protest. If it were not for our human right to peacefully assemble, to protest, to associate, to express our views, to offer a different vision of society than our leaders, many of us would not be alive today. And make no mistake, while we are here strategizing about how to preserve space for civil society, right-wing leaders are also strategizing about how to close that space. They're exchanging drafts of model laws on how to shut down NGOs. They are refining techniques of cyber hacking in order to disrupt operations. They are engaging in deliberate fake news and propaganda campaigns. So this panel today is not just an act of sharing strategies and learning, it is an act of resistance. It is an act of transnational gathering, precisely the kind of transnational gathering that the leaders of too many countries do not want us to have. And that's what makes it a particular honor for us to co-chair this event. I neglected to introduce myself. My name's Jonathan Cohen. I direct the public health program at the Open Society Foundations, where we proudly support human rights organizations advancing HIV activism and a number of other health issues. And it's my very great pleasure to turn it over to my co-chair, Karen Kaplan from Asia Catalyst, who will introduce our panel. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon. We've come so far in so many ways in the epidemic, and so to be witnessing this trend against human rights defenders in the context of HIV is distressing and very real, and requires a coming together to understand the scope and launch a response. I'm therefore thrilled to present our stellar lineup of panelists today, and I'll introduce each of them just before they speak. And our format will be that each panelist will speak, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A, and Jonathan and Sean Mellers will be giving closing remarks. So we look forward to hearing your stories and responses to the presentations today. I am thrilled to introduce Peter Sorosi as our first panelist. He is from Hungary, a human rights activist and drug policy expert, the founder and editor of the Drug Reporter website since 2004, the author of hundreds of articles co-author of books and director of several films about harm reduction, the 2017 recipient of the International Rolleston Award. He's also the director of director of the Drug Policy Program at the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union between 2004 and 2015, and he has been the director of the Rights Reporter Foundation since 2016. He is experienced in working at the International Drug Policy Forums and has produced reports about the Commission on Narcotic Drugs and the UNGAS on drugs in 2016, and many more things. So please, Peter, welcome.
Thank you. Hey, good afternoon. I'm sorry I don't find my presentation in the list. Can you help? Okay, I start without the presentation. I got many questions from people who, just watching the news about Hungary. No, that's not that one.
Do you see yours up here?
No.
Would you have a PowerPoint?
Yeah, I PowerPoint.
What if it's not on here? It's not.
All right. So I'm sorry, my presentation is not here, but so I get many worried questions from people outside of Hungary, like what's really happening in Hungary? Is it like turning to a dictatorship in the middle of the European Union? And what I can answer to those questions is not yet. So Hungary is not a dictatorship yet. The best term how we can describe the situation in Hungary or describe the system which exists now in Hungary is an informational autocracy. That was the best term I ever heard about this system. So autocrats of today, they don't really need open repression. They don't need tanks. They don't really need torture rooms. What they need is a very effective propaganda machine that makes people believe that they are the competent leaders of our countries. And what they also need is to restrict freedom of association, so to restrict civil society and silence those voices that are criticizing the government. And in Hungary, in my country, the attack against civil society started in 2014 when the government scapegoated those NGOs, those civil society organizations that received funding from foreign donors. And why we are scapegoated and why we are in the spotlight? Because actually receiving money from international donors means that you are independent from the government. The government has no control over you. So when you are receiving the money from international donors, you are free to criticize the government. And that's why we are dangerous for those with power and those with privileges. And my organization advocates for the human rights of drug users, sex workers, and people living with HIV/AIDS. And those organizations who receive funding from international donors, now they are required to register in a government registry. The law was adopted in 2017, and this law requires us to register as foreign-funded NGOs, also to label every publications as foreign-funded NGO, and also if you violate these rules, then you first instance you will pay a fine, and second instance the court can abolish the NGO. And apart from this legislation, the government is pursuing a kind of hate propaganda in the Hungarian media against NGOs, especially funded by George Soros. Maybe some of you have seen pictures of how George Soros was, highlighted in big billboard campaigns all over Hungary as the enemy of the Hungarian people, and he was made a kind of public enemy number one in Hungary. So the government spent huge money from public resources to advertise or campaign against George Soros and us NGOs who are supported by him. And the latest round of kind of legislative reforms of the government was the so-called Stop Soros law, which was adopted this year. Very cynically, this law was adopted on the International Refugee Day, and this law actually criminalizes helping to refugees and migrants, and criminalizes those NGOs who are helping migrants and refugees. There is a huge xenophobic campaign against migrants and refugees in my country, which is, of course, not really because we have so big problems of migration, because the number of refugees and migrants coming to Hungary is very small, but still it's used for fear-mongering in Hungary. And how it affects our work in the field of harm reduction and HIV prevention in Hungary. So my government adopted a very repressive national drug strategy in 2013, and this drug strategy aims to make Hungary drug-free, and it condemns harm reduction actually, or it does not support harm reduction, and consequently the budget for all harm reduction programs was cut, and there were some political attacks against needle and syringe programs especially. In Budapest there were 6 needle and syringe programs funded by the national government, and in 2014 the government ruling party organized demonstrations against the needle exchange programs, and they claimed that the needle and syringe programs are responsible for attracting drug users to the neighborhood, and they forced the 2 largest needle and syringe programs to close down. So these 2 largest programs distributed 55% of clean needles in the country. After closing them down, the access to clean needles is extremely low, so it's less than 30 needles per year per injecting drug users, which is much lower than recommended by international organizations. Now, there is these laws and these interventions also have a chilling effect on civil society. So those NGOs who receive funding from international donors, they have difficulty, to cooperate with any kind of local authorities or institutions. So everybody is afraid to build any kind of partnership with those NGOs. So apart from the legal consequences, we have this chilling effect, and that's also, affecting the lives of people who are living with HIV. I always used to say that it's not we activists who are really in danger in Hungary, but those people we represent, because, most of the activists, they speak foreign languages, they can move from the country if they really need to, but those people we represent, they don't have any opportunity to leave. They will be imprisoned, criminalized. The drug laws were restricted in Hungary, so now more people going to prison because of simple possession of drugs. Maybe something about what works and what does not work in advocacy in this repressive environment. So there are a few NGOs who resist to this new law, the anti-Soros law and anti-NGO law. My NGO with 9 or 8 other NGOs, we refused to register as foreign agents in this registry, and we challenged this law at the Constitutional Court and also at the European Human Rights Court. So we have the benefit of being member of the European Union, and we can use some of the mechanisms this provides, and we use all these channels we can use in legal channels to challenge this law. And also we organize mass media campaigns, and we organize mass demonstrations against these laws. Civil society organizations keep together now. So that apart from this chilling effect, actually this current situation also had this effect or consequence that some of the NGOs are now cooperating better. Those NGOs who are, the victims of this repression, now they come together and they organize there are much more cooperation in civil society than it was before. So it's kind of unintended consequence of this law. And I also think that in this when you work in this kind of environment, when you are scapegoated, when you are made a public enemy, you have to reduce your ambition. So I think we have to be less ambitious with our goals. So we should proceed with small steps and also kind of protect those. As one Hungarian philosopher, István Bibo, said, small circles of liberty exist in society, and we have to protect those small circles of liberty, which is actually civil society itself. And we should be less ambitious with the goals. And also, I think it's important to change the way how we are thinking and we are perceiving advocacy. So, the traditional way of advocacy in developed democracies is that you present the evidence and you present the facts to the decision makers, and then you expect that the decision makers will act according to the evidence. But what we see is that it doesn't work anymore. So, and I think it's also a kind of it's something which was missed by civil society before, that we have to work much more on talking to the man on the street. We have to convince people on the street. We have to address their prejudices. We have to be way less complex in our communication. We have to keep it to simple messages and reach out to people. And now what is on our advantage is that all NGOs can be their own media. My NGO, for example, specialized on producing online videos, and these online videos can reach out many people through social media and can have a powerful effect. What's also important here is we have to highlight human stories instead of just presenting the facts and the evidence, because I think storytelling is much more effective in our advocacy. Just to conclude, because I have very limited time, I think it's also important to know, because I feel at this conference that many of our activists now feel a bit depressed, and they are like losing faith in what they are doing, questioning the meaning of the work, what they are doing. But it's also important to note that why we are under attack and why we are scapegoated by this illiberal autocrats is because we did something good, because we are really dangerous for those with power and those with privileges. We are really, threatening their privileges. So we are doing something good, and I think it's important to keep that in mind when we are doing our everyday work. That we are exactly now in the spotlight because we are doing something good, and we should not stop that. We should have always improve what we are doing, but we should not stop that. And it's also a message to international donors, of course, that please don't retreat, but please support NGOs and community activists who are working in these environments. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Devan Vorontsov from Lithuania. He's working with the Eurasian Harm Reduction Association as a sustainability and advocacy advisor since 2017. He graduated with a master's in science and public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in 2010. He's working in the area of HIV prevention in the Eastern Europe and Central Asia region for the past 14 years. Welcome.
Thank you, Kareem. Yeah, and just to clarify, actually, besides working with the Eurasian Harm Reduction Association, which is based in Lithuania, I'm for almost 10 years working with this great organization, Andrei Rylko Foundation for Health and Social Justice, which is based in Russia, in Moscow, and I'm myself from Russia and live in Moscow. That's why I will present about our experience here today. So just to start, to give you under the some information about the organization I'm from. Our under Lico Foundation for Health and Social Justice. It's like a small community-based, local, Moscow-based organization, which was established almost 10 years ago in 2009 with a mission to promote and develop human drug policies based on tolerance, protection of health, dignity, and human rights. And our main spheres of activities, it's like the provision of direct harm reduction services on the streets of Moscow to people who use drugs. Also the drug policy related advocacy with a particular focus on the introduction of the OST treatment in Russia, drug policy and human rights focused watchdogging and capacity building of people of the communities of people who use drugs. There will be some photos of our work in my presentation. So now just to remind you about the HIV, about the situation with HIV epidemic in Russia, like to give you the context we work in. So the region of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, it's the only region in the world where the HIV epidemic continues to grow, unfortunately, and according to UNAIDS Russia, in fact, it's the driving force of the HIV epidemic in the region because, for example, in 2016, it was responsible for 81% of new cases in the region being registered. And for several years, we have a concentrated epidemic among key populations, such as people who use drugs, men who have sex with men, and sex workers. And also, we have a generalized epidemic in some parts of the country, in some sub-regions. And still, the main driver, still 70% of all new HIV cases in Russia are associated with the use of the injection drugs. And still, the main way of HIV transmission is parenteral, and actually we have more than 1,220,000 cases being officially registered as on the end of 2017 of HIV infection, but only 35% of those people living with HIV have access to treatment. Having such situation with HIV epidemic in country, unfortunately, the Russian government does not really support the implementation of HIV prevention programs among key affected populations on the federal level. And also the last Global Fund HIV grant came to an end at the end of the last year, and not sure if we ever will receive new support from the Global Fund. So actually not much funding is available for NGOs working in country doing the HIV prevention work among key populations. And actually, those NGOs which are still working, they operate in the hostile environment of the foreign agent law. This law was introduced in 2012, and since then all NGOs which receive foreign funding and which implement political activities, they should be registered as a foreign agents. And just like in Russia, with its Soviet Union background, to be labeled as a foreign agent is the same like being labeled as a traitor, officially and publicly. And needless to say that this definition of political activity could be interpreted and is interpreted very broad. After this law was introduced, more than 1,000 NGOs, they underwent unexpected inspections by prosecution office in 2013. A few of them were labeled as foreign agents. A few of them were closed. In June 2014, Minister of Justice got the right to declare itself, to decide itself which NGOs should be put on the list of foreign agents, and also the recommendation was issued for all governmental structures not to avoid dealing with those NGOs which were put on the list of foreign agents. Starting from 2016, actually, we see the tendency for NGOs working in the sphere of HIV/AIDS prevention to being put more oftenly into this list. So out of 76 NGOs which were put on the list of foreign agents, 10 of them are those working working in the field of HIV/AIDS prevention in Russia, and the last one was Timur Islamov Foundation from Tatarstan, from Kazan, was included into the list just 2 weeks ago. Yes. So my organization was officially labeled by the Minister of Justice for the foreign agent in June 2016, 2 years ago, and the political activities which was incriminated to our organization was actually the advocacy for introduction of opiate substitution treatment in Russia. This is official. We have like the documents where it's written. And just for you to understand that the law works in such a way that like NGOs, they should register themselves as a foreign agent. So we need to kind of go and confess that we are the foreign agent. If we don't do this, and if it's the Minister of Justice who put us onto the list, it means that like such NGOs who was not registered by themselves but was put on the list by the Minister of Justice, they are automatically being considered as the administrative offender. And they need to be fined. They are fined in the amount equivalent to $5,000 which for NGOs like is a substantial amount of money. So this is what happened to us. We were put on the list of the foreign agents by the Minister of Justice, and they tried to fine us. In August 2016, we went to the court, and after 2 consecutive trials to the court against the Minister of Justice, after 2 consecutive trials, the court has dismissed the case of an administrative offense, and we were not fined. And this was for the first time in law enforcement practice in Russia on foreign agent law. Also, as we don't consider ourselves as a foreign agent, and we disagree with the decision of the Ministry of Justice to put us on this list, so we also tried to challenge this decision in the court as well. But unfortunately, in 2017, we lost both the district court and the Moscow city court, and they refused to meet our claims, and they left the foundation with the status of the foreign agent. So now, today we're heading to the European Court on Human Rights with this case. So just to conclude, yes, like we do carry out our work using the foreign funding, but it's not because like it's the only way we want to do this. We applied for the governmental funding in last few years, like at least for 4 times, but our applications were never supported. And like I'm working now on the one more application, which I'm sure that will not be supported as well. So it's not like us who don't want to receive governmental funding and work like on the governmental money. It's the government who doesn't want to support our activities in Russia. Unfortunately, for a long time, HIV prevention among key affected population is not being funded from the public funds in Russia, and it seems nothing will change in the nearest future because, for example, as the new HIV strategy till 2020, which was adopted in 2016, it doesn't support harm reduction services at all. And actually, till now, this status of foreign agent didn't really affect our work. So we continue to receive foreign funding and provide harm reduction services for people who use drugs on the streets of Moscow. But we are constantly, because of this status, we are constantly under a threat of being fined for any minor violation of the foreign agent law. And they can find us as many times as they want, and actually this could lead to the closure of the organization. And you should understand that this law is like a hammer hanging on you, and you never know when it will fall down on you. And this law is it's just an instrument of the control of by the government of the independent NGOs, which could be applied at any moment. And it's really sad that NGOs providing HIV prevention services to key affected populations in Russia are being considered as a threat by the government, especially taking into account the situation with HIV epidemic in country, which continues to escalate. Thank you, and please join our campaign, which probably you see, Chase Virus, Not People.
Thank you, Ivan. I'd like to introduce the next panelist, who's Alberto Nieves, who is from Venezuela. He's an HIV-positive defender of human rights of people with HIV and LGBTI people. He is the executive director of Citizen Action Against AIDS, a Venezuelan NGO created more than 31 years ago. He is a founding member of the Venezuelan Network of Positive People and the Latin American Network of People Living with HIV and AIDS. Thank you. Alberto. And Mariana Vicasa.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. He's going to speak in Spanish and I'm going to be translating for him.
Un honor para mí estar en esta sala para presentarles la situación en Venezuela.
It's an honor for me to be here with you to present you the situation in Venezuela.
Venezuela queda en Sudamérica.
Venezuela is a South American country.
Esa mujer que ustedes ven en la pantalla es una mujer que vive con VIH.
So that woman that you see in the picture is a woman living with HIV.
Ella es una activista, una defensora de los derechos humanos.
She is an activist and a human rights defender.
Ella en este momento, Ángela, está hospitalizada por falta de tratamientos antirretrovirales.
So her name is Angela and she is in hospital because she doesn't have access to ARVs.
Ángela también está hospitalizada en este momento, tiene una cirrosis hepática y no tiene tratamiento en Venezuela.
She also has a hepatic cirrhosis and she doesn't have a treatment for that either.
Esta foto que ustedes están viendo fue una protesta el 18 de abril de este año.
So that picture was taken on the 18th of April this year.
Y ahí más de 500 personas que vivimos con VIH nos paramos frente al Ministerio de Salud a protestar de forma pacífica.
So that day, more than 500 people living with HIV were protesting at the doors of the Ministry of Health, and we were in peace.
Exigiendo que se garantice el derecho a la vida y a la salud.
So we were asking for the government to respect and implement the right to health and the right to
Lo que
life.
estamos exigiendo es un derecho que está establecido en la Constitución de mi país.
So what we are asking for is a right that is established in the national constitution in Venezuela.
Lo que nosotros estamos exigiendo es lo que está establecido en los acuerdos, pactos y tratados internacionales suscritos por Venezuela en el Concierto de Naciones Unidas.
And they are also recognized in many of the agreements in the international arena, and they are part of the United Nations.
Y Ángela, por protestar porque le faltaban sus medicamentos, esa lista de medicamentos que ustedes ven allí en la pantalla.
So she was protesting because there is no ARVs in Venezuela. All the ARVs that you see listed in that list, we don't have them.
El gobierno de Venezuela nos lanzó a los militares.
So the Venezuelan government sent the National Guard and the police to greet us while we were protesting in a peaceful way.
Esta es la realidad venezolana.
So that's the Venezuelan reality.
Yo soy Alberto Nieves, de Acción Ciudadana contra el SIDA y de la Red Venezolana de Gente Positiva.
See, he is Alberto Nieves from Citizen Action Against AIDS, Acción Ciudadana contra el SIDA, and the Venezuelan Network of People Living with HIV.
Venezuela en este momento vivimos algo que jamás habíamos vivido, una emergencia humanitaria compleja.
So in Venezuela we are living a complex humanitarian emergency.
Es un resultado de inestabilidad política, de conflicto, de violencia, de desigualdad social y de pobreza.
It is the result of many different issues: economic instability, political, cultural, and social issues that are eroding the basis of democracy.
En Venezuela no hay una catástrofe natural, no hay un tsunami, no hay un terremoto.
So the emergency in Venezuela is not caused by natural cause. There is no tsunami, there is no earthquake.
En Venezuela lo que hay es una emergencia humanitaria compleja.
What we have in Venezuela is humanitarian emergency crisis.
En Venezuela la crisis política es producto de una ruptura del orden constitucional.
So in Venezuela the political crisis is caused by a rupture in the constitutional order.
El gobierno usurpa funciones de la Asamblea Nacional, del Congreso.
So the executive branch is taking on all the powers in the government, from the legislative, the judicial, the citizens' power, and also the electoral power.
El gobierno está usurpando las funciones del sistema de administración de justicia.
And the most important one is the Justice Department.
Hay una pérdida de independencia, monopolización del poder.
So there is no independence, and the power is monopolized by the executive branch.
Y respeto de las decisiones del pueblo.
And there is no respect to the citizens' decision.
Y una total militarización de la seguridad ciudadana.
And the army is on the streets saying that they are taking care of the citizens.
En este sentido, también tenemos una crisis económica y social en Venezuela.
We also have a social and economical crisis in
Tenemos
Venezuela.
un nivel de pobreza que está llegando al 87%.
Our poverty rate is around 87%.
Y aumentó la mortalidad materna un 30%.
And the maternal mortality rate increased 30%.
Y esto está incidiendo en la respuesta del VIH.
And of course, it has incidence in the response to HIV.
Y aquí, en Venezuela, los defensores de derechos humanos de las personas que vivimos con VIH en el área de salud nos están difamando. Existe una campaña de difamación, de criminalización y de obstáculos en contra de los defensores de derechos humanos en Venezuela.
There is a defamation campaign against human rights defenders, people living with HIV, those that go out to protest. They are using the state-owned media, and the social protest is criminalized.
Y existe una negación del acceso a la información pública.
And there is complete lack of access to public information.
Y es lógico que personas que viven con VIH, como ustedes lo están viendo en este momento,
And it's logic that people living with HIV, all of them in the picture,
salimos a las calles a protestar.
we go to the street and protest.
Y esas personas que ustedes que ven allí son personas que viven con VIH, son personas de distintas condiciones de salud crónica.
So those people that you see there are people living with HIV and people that are living with other chronic conditions.
Nosotros concientizamos que el ejercicio ciudadano, indistintamente de la represión, hay que ejercerlo.
So we believe that your citizen rights, you have to use them and you have to ask the government for respect.
Solo en democracia podemos tener tratamientos antirretrovirales.
So only in democracy you can have antiretroviral
En este
treatment.
momento es un 100% de desabastecimiento de antirretrovirales en Venezuela.
There is 100% stock out of treatment in Venezuela.
En esa foto hay personas con cáncer, con hemofilia, con diabetes.
In that picture you can see people living with HIV, with cancer,
Trasplantados
hemophilia,
renales.
diabetes, and people that have received
Nuestros teléfonos están
transplants.
intervenidos.
Their phone numbers are intervened. Yes.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Ahí están nuestras páginas web donde tienen toda la información.
And you can see the web pages for everybody that have been working on this.
Muchas gracias, Alberto. Our next speaker is Jonas Bagus. He's a program officer at APCASO, an Asia-Pacific network on health and human rights and social justice. He's supporting APCASO's program on health financing and sustainability. Welcome.
I'd like to start by declaring I have no conflict of interest to declare. I was just telling colleagues yesterday that I was born in the late 70s, a few years before the Marcos dictatorship was toppled through a people power revolution. So I grew up in a climate where Filipinos embraced democracy, where human rights, where we were proud as a community, as a people of human rights, where we value human dignity. And that was my narrative about my country, about my nation for so long, until Duterte came. It's still difficult to put words to the figures that you see on the screen. And this is coming from official government figures. From July 1 2016 to May 30, 2018, the Philippine National Police told the Supreme Court that around 20,000 people have already been killed, 4,000 plus of which happened during legitimate police operations where drug suspects or accused drug criminals reportedly fought back or refused arrest. 16,355 of which are deaths under investigation, a term coined by the Philippine National Police and by the Philippine government to avoid using the term extrajudicial killings. They have conducted thousands of anti-drug operations, arrested thousands of individuals, and in their possession, a list of 1.3 million individuals who were forced to say they're either a drug pusher or a drug killer, creating a climate of fear in communities in the Philippines. It's important to note that the war on drugs is also a political weapon for the Duterte administration. Right now, Senator De Lima, who used to be the chairperson of the Commission on Human Rights that investigated extrajudicial killings linked to Duterte when he was still a mayor, is now in jail. Another senator, also a vocal opposition to the war on drugs and a champion of harm reduction, is facing a ridiculous anti-kidnapping case from the government. The vice president was also expressed concerns over the human rights situation in the country, is constantly vilified by Duterte and his allies. The former head of the Supreme Court has been ousted simply because she also stood up for human rights. There's been a spate of killings targeting local governments, local government officials and priests, which could demobilize opposition coming from other politicians and coming from the Catholic Church. While this is happening, the Philippines is facing one of the most explosive, if not the most explosive, HIV epidemic worldwide. The HIV prevalence remains low with a total of 54,000 cases, but a vast majority of which were recorded in the last 5 years. Most of these cases are among gay and bisexual men and trans women, and among people who inject drugs, who constitute 4% of the total HIV cases in the country. Despite these challenges, the government is investing more on the war on drugs. The national government would refuse to engage or talk about harm reduction or pushing for or implementing a more public health approach towards the drugs issue. Public funding is also going to the war on drugs rather than other social services or for health. There's also a climate of stigma against civil society now. It's quite difficult to engage government officials to challenge or to engage their programs on health, and they're very much suspicious of NGOs. Why is this happening? The Philippines is a weak democracy, and its institutions and democratic norms have always been vulnerable to influence by vested interests. So it's important to note that this is also about dynamics among political clans, not based on a particular ideology supported by a particular political party. This is Duterte's personal paradigm, his formula to consolidate political power, his formula to survive in office. He's done this in his city, in Davao, and he's thinking that this is a viable option for him as a national political leader. There's hardly any clear vision or any clear government policy on the war on drugs. And it's very difficult to identify what they want to do with those who have surrendered, whether they have rehabilitation or treatment programs. The war on drugs has really emboldened impunity and attacks against democracy in the Philippines. There's an ongoing police campaign against loitering despite the fact that we have already decriminalized vagrancy that has affected gay men and sex workers in the country. There's an anti-smoking ban that's now being used to raid establishments. Attacks against independent media. A push to revise the Constitution that potentially could give Duterte 8 more years in power. How are communities resisting to these attacks? There are several initiatives happening on the ground to document human rights violations, including the killings, that's aligned with efforts to file a case or aligned to the efforts to submit cases to the International Criminal Court. from which the Philippines has already withdrawn, but which still has jurisdiction over violations that happened and will happen until March next year. There are community groups and NGOs doing their best, despite challenges to resources, despite closing spaces, to deliver services to people who use drugs, to deliver ART, to PLHIVs in detention. There are also civil society organizations advocating for harm reduction, a relatively new NGO that has become a go-to institution, training civil society, other civil society organizations, government officials on harm reduction just to change the perspective of the people on drugs. There's a local governance NGO that's been sensitizing local officials on harm reduction, a group of young lawyers sensitizing their own sector to push for drug policy reforms, and several efforts to reach out to urban poor communities that are disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. There are many lessons to what's happening in the Philippines. The first of which, it shows the deplorable inadequacy of our business-as-usual approach in our HIV response, one where human rights is seen as a donor add-on or as a lip service and not as a core of what we do. The second is that we need, more than ever, inter-movement solidarity to build new grounds for collaboration between and among, say, urban poor communities affected by the war on drugs and HIV NGOs that understand that there's a better alternative to what's happening on the ground. And lastly, that we need to invest in communities, not just because they play a role in service delivery, but because communities drive change. They are our first responders, and that's what we're seeing in the Philippines. And to be honest, in these dire times, there are also our reasons to hope. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jonas. I'm so pleased to introduce our final speaker, Salyo Tabitha, Deputy Executive Director of the Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network, a lawyer by profession and an advocate of the Kenyan High Court. She holds a master's in law on human rights and democratization in Africa from University of Pretoria. Professionally, she has previously engaged in private practice and served at the Federation of Women Lawyers in Kenya and consulted for UNDP. I'd also like to plug her and others' reports, Reinforcing Marginalization, the Impact of the Closing of Civic Space on the HIV Response in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda, which is available in the front row. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, the afternoon shift is often known as the graveyard shift because there's always a risk that you're speaking to people who are perhaps asleep. And I want to reassure all of you that I can see you from here. So if there's anyone who is asleep, please wake up. I promise to keep this short and sweet, and I promise that I'll try and attempt to be not so depressing as my colleagues from the Philippines and Venezuela have been, but just to be able to demonstrate to you in the next 7 minutes something different, a narrative that is being used in the East Africa community and particularly in Kenya when it comes to the shrinking space of civil society. In the next few minutes, what I'll try to do is just create for you a landscape of what has been happening and examining what we've been doing between 2014 and 2018 in terms of the space that we have as civil society and what has been going on in Kenya. In doing so, I want to be able to just demonstrate to you the levels of arbitrariness that has been exercised by our government in an attempt to control civil society organizations. I'll also try and just demonstrate to you some of the blatant disrespect by the executive of court orders that we've had. And finally, I'll be able to just show you how the law has been used in some instances as a tool for repression and an attempt to actually curtail the space of civil society. Doing so, I will be able to just give and demonstrate using 5 case studies. One on the use of deregistration as a tool to intimidate civil society. Number 2, refusal to register civil societies and as an alternative when deregistration doesn't work. Number 3, intimidation and raids, which has become a popular tool of use by the government and our Kenya Revenue Authority. Number 4, the failure to operationalize laws that could be supportive of civil society organizations. And lastly, a practice that we have started adopting from other countries, which is to shift the location of the docket of civil society organizations from the Ministry of Planning to the Ministry of Interior and Security. Lastly, I'll try and just make a few recommendations on the way forward. Ladies and gentlemen, in December 2014, the NGO Coordination Board in Kenya deregistered 510 non-governmental organizations. In October 2015, the same NGO Coordination Board put on alert 957 NGO organizations with a threat that the 957 organizations would be deregistered. Now, the common thread and the common reasons that were always propelled by the NGO Coordination Board for deregistration was that, one, that these NGOs were carrying out terrorism activities. Number two, that these NGOs had failed to comply in terms of tax compliance. And number three, that there was misappropriation of funds in these NGOs. Key among the NGOs that were in this list of NGOs that were going to be deregistered was APHRC. Many of you may know APHRC, the African Population Research Center that works on a lot of research on HIV. We had organizations such as the Kenya Human Rights Commission. We had organizations such as the Bar Hostess Empowerment Program. We had LVCT, which works on HIV interventions. Some of these organizations were then proceeded to be deregistered, and some of them attempted and fought back the deregistration. Now, one of the things that happens when you have an attempt to deregister is that you spend as an NGO a lot of your time, a lot of your resources trying to fight deregistration instead of fighting the meaningful interventions that you're supposed to be making. A second attempt that has been done by our NGO Coordination Board when deregistration has not been effective is to refuse to register NGOs that are coming up. In March 2013, the NGO Coordination Board, which has the mandate to register NGOs, refused to register the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. Its reason? Number one, that the name was unacceptable. Number two, that same-sex relations in Kenya are criminalized, and therefore they were not going to register an organization that was going to go against the culture of Kenyans, against the morals of Kenyans. Luckily, they did not know who they were fighting. And Eric Gitari, who was the executive and still is the executive director of the National Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, took this matter to court and challenged the actions of the NGO Coordination Board by indicating that this is a freedom of association which is enshrined in our constitution. And in so doing, the High Court of Kenya supported, and I think we deserve to give the High Court of Kenya a clap. The High Court of Kenya actually reversed the decision of the NGO board, and in a 3-judge panel composed of Justice Mumbi Ngugi, Justice George Odunga, and Justice Isaac Lenaola ruled that the NGO board's decision was a violation of the constitutional provisions that we have towards freedom of association. And again, this was the second time that the High Court was doing that, because initially, yet again, in 2014, the NGO Coordination Board had also refused to register the transgender association known as Transgender Education and Advocacy Organization. The third attempt, where deregistration fails, is to raid the organizations. And this is a particular popular practice that has come up, particularly when we are in election mode in Kenya. And what happens is that we have seen the NGO Coordination Board come up with a trend whereby they start identifying and saying that organizations are not registered, they're not complying in terms of taxes, and thereafter they raid these organizations. This is meant to pull down the morale of the people, and this, for instance, what is demonstrated on the picture, was an attempt in August 2017 to raid one of the centers that works on elections good governance in Kenya, known as AFRICOG. And this, for those of you who may have followed a little bit what was happening in Kenya in August 2017, this was slightly immediately after our elections, whereby a few civil society organizations were attempting to think, should we go and petition the High Court as to the irregularities we had seen in our elections? So this is the third attempt, and this has not just happened to one NGO, but has also happened to organizations such as Haki Africa, Muhuri, and any other civil society organization that works on human rights, organizations that question and document violations of human rights, organizations that question elections and election petitions. The fourth attempt and the fourth strategy that we have seen when it comes to the shrinking space of civil society in Kenya is to refuse to operationalize good laws. In 2013, the Parliament of Kenya enacted the PBO Act. And this is one of the progressive laws that seeks to provide for a more enabling environment for NGOs to work, to provide for clear guidelines when it comes to registration of NGOs. It was passed in 2012 and subsequently signed into law by our then President, Mwai Kibaki. But what then happened is that it had a provision that indicated that it must be gazetted for it to come into operation. The government refused to operationalize it. And what in fact happened is that we saw the government trying to sneak in amendments to that PBO Act. In the same year, October 2013, after the PBO Act was passed, that is the Public Benefits Organizations Act was passed, the government, through the National Assembly, attempted to claw back on the gains that had been made. How so? Number one, they introduced what was known as a statute law miscellaneous amendment bill, and in it, they tried to do the following. Number one, to curtail how much NGOs would receive to only 15% from external donors. We know, and I mean this is general knowledge, that our government does not fund these activities. It doesn't fund the activities that a lot of NGOs do, and therefore what they were trying to do is curtail the activities that NGOs do. The second thing that the amendments were trying to prohibit was that civil society organizations should not receive money directly from donors. So they wanted to actually come in and set up something they were calling a Public Benefit Organization Federation, through which all money that would be sent by donors would come in, and then thereafter they would be the ones to redistribute the money. See, such genius, right? Our government is a genius. So this is what they were trying to do. Come up with this federation where all the money is pulled into one pool and then thereafter be the ones to redistribute. And thirdly, they wanted to alter the composition of the regulatory authorities such that it would be very executive heavy and give the authority a lot of discretionary powers, which would mean that they could strike off organizations that were not morally upright or religiously correct. Luckily, what happened is that we had a strong civil society organization and we had a pushback. Now, what happened is that in December 2013, these amendments were withdrawn. How so? What happened is that between introduction of these amendments in 2013 and December 2013, the UN Special Rapporteur on the defense of human rights defenders spoke against these amendments. The UN Special Rapporteur, who then was a Kenyan, on UN Special Rapporteur on peaceful I'm trying to remember the correct name, UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly and Association, who was a Kenyan at that time in 2013, Maina Kiai, also spoke against this act. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights, in fact, in the same year, spoke against this bill. And what happened is that we had a lot of pressure from outside bodies coming in, and therefore the amendments were withdrawn. The last point that has been an increasing worrisome activity in Kenya has been a shift from the body that regulates civil society organizations, because for the longest time, NGOs were regulated by the Ministry of Planning and Devolution. However, in October 2017, we saw a shift whereby the President now gave a directive for the Ministry of Interior to be the one that will be regulating NGOs. This is a practice that perhaps I can say was inspired by only one country that I am aware of, Pakistan, that had in June 2015 previously done the same thing, moving civil society regulation to the docket of interior and security. The question then becomes, are civil societies a threat for us to be moved to the docket of interior? What happened in Kenya is that if you look at the dates, this was slightly before we got we went into our elections. And increasingly, we get worried as to what other directives will be given when it comes to civil society. How then do we safeguard this space that we have? Number one, we have increasingly learned that one of the ways to beat these systems is to comply. Meaning that if you want to make the systems frustrated, make sure that you have complied with everything, including giving your employees their 21 days leave and their maternity leave so that they don't get the employment, courts against you. Make sure that you file your tax returns. Make sure that you have your National Hospital Insurance Fund in order, everything in order. Make sure your paperwork is in order, because that way you make it extra hard for them to, come to you and say you're not complying with your taxes. Secondly, is that we have seen a judiciary that is more open in Kenya and able to interpret the constitution and safeguard some of our spaces using litigation. We have seen civil society organizations, we have seen members of the LGBT community going to court and demanding to be registered, and the court allowing them to be registered, and in fact compelling our NGO coordination board to register them. Number three, for us, something that has worked in some instances is the use of the media, because sometimes we've used the media to illustrate and highlight some of these punitive and arbitrary measures that are taken. When a planned raid is happening, just before it happens, we alert the media and we put them on the standby. Lastly, is perhaps for us to think about how do donors then also, as our partners, set aside emergency funds for us? Because one of the things that is increasingly happening is that by the time you're being deregistered, your accounts are frozen. You do not have money for your staff, you do not have money for your programs, you do not have money for any interventions. These things happen overnight. It's a Nicodemus move. For those of you who are Christians, you'll understand Nicodemus went to see Jesus in the middle of the night. That's how it happens for us. You wake up in the morning, you're deregistered. So maybe just to plead with those of us who are here, who are from the donor and partner side, how do we set up an emergency funding and an emergency kitty to be able to support the work of civil societies from Venezuela, from Honduras, from the Philippines, when they need it most, when their funds have been frozen? Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, I want to take this time to honor a great member, a lawyer, a colleague, Willie Kimani, who lost his life in June 2016, simply because he refused to abide by what was a threat from the police. He disappeared immediately after he came from court in June 2016, and thereafter was found a week later, strangled and dead.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn it over to Sean Mellers from the United Kingdom. He's a well-known international activist, co-founder of the Global Network of People Living with HIV and AIDS, and former board member for the Communities Delegation to the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. Originally from South Africa, Sean has been openly living with HIV for more than 30 years, and he is a passionate human rights advocate. He currently holds the role of Director of Knowledge and Influence at the International HIV/AIDS Alliance. Sean.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The power of the human story that we have just heard has been immense. Jonathan was talking about the tools of authoritarian leaders stay the same, but they've adapted to the changing context and the changing environment. When something as simple as having your own funding is seen as a threat, we know that they are afraid of us. When they close down our programs and take away our needles and syringes because they fear us being more relevant than them, we know that we are powerful. When they try and silence us or call us foreign agents because we have voice, travel, and amplify the injustices, we know that we are relevant. When they try and limit our space to organize and mobilize, to connect and energize, we know that they are threatened. I would like us to give another round of applause to the panelists, please, for their bravery and their continued work. I have the privilege of trying to moderate the next 20-25 minutes of discussion and questions. I am going to ask you, if you have a question, to please come to the microphones. You will see them in the middle of the aisles. I can hopefully see all the numbers. It is a little bright. There we go. Thank you very much. And please feel free to ask any question to one of the panelists. We encourage you to try and keep your questions tight and focused so that we are able to get through as many questions as possible. I see somebody behind microphone number 5. I'll take a group of questions, so if you have a question, please stand behind the microphone so long. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you for these excellent, moving presentations. I have a question for Ivan. You mentioned that the case was going to the European Court. Could you just say a little bit more about what that is and whether it has any jurisdiction in Russia?
Hold on, please. I'm going to take a few questions, if you can just jot them down. Behind microphone number 4, please.
Yes, I'm from the Philippines. I'm from the University of the Philippines, Manila, and I'm a researcher. I would like to react to the presentation of Mr. Jonas. I think you're now in Thailand, but you're a Filipino. Well, I think you should have given a complete picture of the civil rights in our country now, because you have not mentioned about the deaths directly from drug addicts themselves or from crimes committed by drug addicts. And you must remember that during the time of Duterte, I'm not defending the president, I just want you to present a complete picture. In the time of Duterte, the drug abuse centers and treatment increased to 14 centers. And we also partner with San Miguel. Because of the limited resources, the government partner with private firms like Mega World and San Miguel. I think you should mention about the effort of our government also to resolve the issue of drug addicts. Lastly, I remember that the past president of our country refused to award a National Artist Award to one of the famous actresses we have because of a previous history of drug abuse. So I think that should also be mentioned.
Great, thank you very much. We prefer to call them people who use drugs. Microphone number 5, please, and then I'll ask the panel to respond.
I'm Joseph. I'm from India. I wanted to comment on the presentation from Kenya, because there are many governments which are putting a lot of pressure on the NGOs. So I just wanted to ask you about what is the strategies of the NGO coalitions in these countries and how do they address this issue, and what are the lobby advocacy measures that you take to tackle these issues in different countries?
Great, thank you very much. Panelists, would you like to begin with the first question, Andre? And I'll come around for a second round of questions. So if you have a question, please come to the microphones. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Regarding the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, yes, fortunately, the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights still have a force in Russia. That's why we have put our case to it. But as far as I know, Russia are trying to make some attempts to withdraw from European Court of Human Rights, so from jurisdiction of the court. And there were a number of discussions about it in the government, and so the tendency is to make Russia independent of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. And if this happens, then probably it's we will lose the last instrument we can use against the government to protect our rights. Hopefully, if this will happen, but this will happen in a few years later.
Thank you. Jonas, any comments or reactions?
I mean, I think I'd like to express that I respect her opinion, but facts are facts. You're entitled to your opinion, but facts would bear out what's truly happening in the country. And if you look at the data, the number of homicide cases in the country prior to the war on drugs, what's happening is the real crisis. And this is not something that I've invented. This is even based on the report submitted by the Philippine National Police to the Supreme Court.
Thanks, Jonas. Tabitha?
My question was on the strategies that we're using in Kenya. So we have both what I would call long-term strategies and short-term strategies. Short-term strategies are when you close your eyes and you wake up and tomorrow morning you're being raided. And that's where we now, we have human rights defenders. There's a coalition that works with human rights defenders. And during that time, our quick reactionary measures will always be use of media, use of court, use of social media in particular in Kenya, whereby we've used it to name and shame. We have increasingly seen NGOs come together, even though we work in different spaces and sometimes we're deemed to be competitive. When this happens, we come together and we fight together. So the long-term strategies are usually like litigating, going to court, because this takes a little bit more time. And then we have the short-term measures whereby we round ourselves up, we call for meetings, we are able to now have quick actions, whether it is calling upon friends of Kenya. We have, for instance, used platforms whereby we have the UN Special Rapporteurs coming on board, we have the African Commission coming on board and calling out some of these events when they do happen.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to go to microphone 1, microphone 3, and microphone 4. And then we'll have another round. So please, ma'am, microphone 1.
Hi, I'm Shavana from Pakistan. Actually, we are facing the same issues as of Kenya because they are inspired from our country as well. So I wanted to ask from all the panelists that is it possible to bring a global resolution for the protection of human rights defenders working on HIV and harm reduction?
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you, ma'am. Microphone number 3.
Thank you so much. By name Peter Garang from South Sudan. My question goes to my neighbor that is a Kenyan. I have actually seen we have the shared values or maybe the shared responsibilities. But again, what are you doing to ensure that the same services that you are giving to your people, we also have as a South Sudan, being at the young age to learn from you such that we can also move our advocacy forward. As currently as we speak, we don't have any law in South Sudan that is being done on HIV/AIDS. The law is there, but it's still not being approved for almost 5 years now. People are focusing on different issues. So it is just like, what are you doing to ensure that your colleagues from the region are also getting experiences from you such that we all move together? Because in HIV/AIDS, if you are excelling and you leave other people behind, we are not doing anything. Thank you so much.
Great. So if I could just paraphrase, it's a question, a general question to the panelists to try and understand more what they are doing about sharing their experiences and information with other people in the region, in particular in Africa. Okay, thank you. Microphone number 4, please.
Yeah, thank you. A big thank you to the presenters. I'm Lucy from Kenya. Now, I'm just thinking, just thinking out of the box, because some of the reasons why our space is shrinking as civil society organizations are economic, as was mentioned by Tabitha. But just thinking out of the box, how then do we support, in as much as international donors may be coming in to support our interventions, but the funding may not always be forthcoming. So how can we think out of the box to have, the echo is too much of, okay, to have some of our local, resource mobilization to support our interventions, because even as in the case of Russia, 35% of people living with HIV not being able to access ARVs. At this point in time when science has shown that actually ART treatment is prevention, is ridiculous. So we need to think out of the box how we can, locally support our interventions, even as we wait for international donors to come and support us through the harsh environment that we go through in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I see 3 more people behind the microphone, so I am going to take them because we are busy running short of time, and then I'll direct the questions to the panelists. So microphone number 5, please.
Hi, I'm Dr. Willem Moica from the University of the Philippines. I would like to react to Jonas. Jonas, I follow you at Twitter. I know you live in Thailand, but I agree with your observations, and those are fact-based. My question for the panel is, can you really say somebody is pro-life or human rights advocate when they want to help people living with the HIV, but they want people who use drugs to die? Is that logical? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Microphone number 4.
Hello, I'm Shama from India, and I teach at a university in, close to Delhi. My question is mostly to the speaker from Kenya, but I think it can be directed to everybody on the panel. My question is to do with the use of university students for civil society activism. So I have heard a lot about civil society being mobilized in various ways, but I think students are not harnessed enough in most of the countries that we have heard from. So one of my questions is, why do the panelists think that is true? And do you have any strategies to integrate these people, the students who are actually very energetic, into the mainstream activism that all these NGOs indulge in? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And microphone number 5, please.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Yensadi Swats. I'm with the Open Society based in Johannesburg. I want to say that we see the shrinking spaces. We absolutely recognize and applaud the bravery and the resilience of people like the activists that we have on stage. Tabita, I hear you about emergency funding. As donors too, we are seen and perceived differently in different spaces. Is there a role for us beyond just giving the funds? What is it that you would want us to do beyond just getting money to you?
Great, thank you very much, Ian. So I'm going to turn to the panelists now. I'm not going to ask you all to answer all the questions. I'm going to try and direct the questions to some of you. And the first question was related to, is it possible to bring protection on human rights and harm reduction? And I wonder whether Ivan would like to try and answer that question in terms of what is happening in that area.
Again, speaking from like the experience of our country, we actually, like my organization, we don't hope like that the government in like maybe even our lifetime will step in and like start provide OST treatment or harm reduction programs. OST treatment is like strictly prohibited by law in Russia, and we don't hope like to expect any changes, at least until like we have the current president, which probably will rule until he dies, we do just the work we do for our friends and our like people, participants of our projects, and we continue what we can do like on for the community, no matter like what's the policies of the government. So I don't see any like solution for this in Russia, at least like in nearest future, but maybe it's my vision.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ivan. I think also just to add that there are a number of international tools and processes underway, and next year is the CND happening in Vienna, which I think is going to become an important turning point in terms of harm reduction and how the world needs to respond to that. Peter, I wonder whether you are willing to respond to the question around what else can funders do, what else can donors do apart from just giving money?
Well, yeah, that's a difficult one. What it was told about, creating this emergency funding possibilities, I think that's quite an innovative and good idea. I mean, I can't think about anything else.
Become an advocate. Talk out publicly about.
I don't think that donors should switch the role and be advocates themselves. So donors should stay donors. And just turning back to the other thing, I think just to create a resolution to defend human rights defenders, I think it wouldn't work. So what we really see is that some of the international donors are now retreating from many parts of the world, especially in the field of harm reduction. What we see is that we documented the collapse of harm reduction services in southern Eastern Europe, for example, where there were harm reduction services. Now there is absolutely no services. So I think before we can contemplate on what donors can do apart from funding, I think the first thing is that donors must fund communities and NGOs, because we see that that money is actually shrinking. It's not only civil society space is shrinking, but money on harm reduction programs is very, it's kind of extinct. And we see that even in the European Union, in Bulgaria and Romania, needle exchange just stopped this year. There is absolutely no needle exchange in these countries, and they are members of the European Union. So I think we have a kind of emergency situation, and donors have to come together as a donor community and have to address these issues. That's only I can tell.
No, that's great. I saw, Jonas, you had your hand up. Do you want to add on to that?
I think donors are also in a very strategic position to facilitate inter-movement linkages and learning from south to south, facilitating south learning and collaboration. What we're seeing now isn't just isolated cases of attacks against civil society or closing of civic spaces, but somehow authoritarian regimes copying from each other. And they can also flag these concerns to advocates as well.
Okay, great. Alberto, the question about students and being able to use students students in inverted commas as a resource. Can you share some of your experiences in Venezuela, how students have become involved in adding voice and amplifying the crisis?
Sí, efectivamente, en Venezuela existe un fuerte movimiento de estudiantes universitarios y de nivel media.
In fact, in Venezuela there is a strong and very organized student movement, both in the university and high school.
Justamente el año pasado podemos decir que hubo una masacre contra nuestro movimiento estudiantil.
And there was a massacre, in fact, against the student movement in Venezuela during the protests.
Muchos de ellos no llegaban a 21 años de edad.
Most of them were younger than 21.
Por cierto, un amigo mío que es padre de uno de esos niños o de esos muchachos que murieron, David Vallenilla, murió, lo mataron con 19 años de edad.
So one of his, he has a friend, and his son was killed when he was 19 years old. Last name Vallenilla.
Algunos de esos estudiantes universitarios vivían con VIH.
Some of them were living with HIV.
Y dieron su vida para el rescate de la democracia venezolana.
and they gave their lives trying to rescue the democracy in Venezuela.
Sin embargo, en Venezuela no tenemos miedo.
However, in Venezuela, we are not afraid.
Gracias, Alberto. And Tabita, the final question is coming to you about what are you doing differently to share information, experiences with other organizations in Africa to try and minimize the closing space for civil society?
So thank you very much for that. The gentleman who asked that is Garang from South Sudan, and I want to specifically address him because of the fact that I'm so excited. The South Sudan has just joined the East Africa community, and one of the amazing things that has just happened is that East Africa community has enacted an ESC HIV Prevention and Management Act. Now, the charter, the treaty establishing the East Africa community indicates that any law that is enacted by the ESC supersedes national laws. So for South Sudan, what this means, because if I hear him right, he said that in South Sudan there's no law on HIV and that they've been just sitting and waiting for it for 5 years. And that means that you do have a law. You have the East Africa Community HIV Prevention and Management Act, which you can use to support your interventions. This is now, of course, for the ESC, the East Africa Community. For the rest of Africa, the spaces that we have been using is the African Commission and the AU. What we pride ourselves in is at the African space, the conversations and narrative on HIV and human rights defenders has been very widely spoken about. We have an African Commission resolution of 2004 on the protection of human rights defenders in Africa. In 2011, the African Commission again passed a resolution on the protection of human rights defenders in Africa. So at the African Commission space, we have seen a lot of boldness by the Commission to come up with narratives and to come up with resolutions. The sad reality, of course, is that this Commission, resolutions are never implemented, but then it can be used as a tool to litigate in your national courts, because you bring it to the front and tell the court, our government has signed on and we are a party to the African Charter. This is a commitment at the international regional space, and therefore we demand that this be implemented.
Okay. Great, thank you very much, Tabita. We could continue the discussion for at least another hour, but I'm going to hand over to my co-chair, Jonathan, to do concluding remarks on behalf of the co-chairs and the moderator.
For our closing remarks, Sean and Karen and I, in our personal capacity, in light of the topic of this panel, would like to convey a message to the International AIDS Society about the holding of AIDS 2020 in Trump's America. We'd like to start by saying to the IAS, you are not the enemy, you are our friend. The enemy is the current political environment in the United States. The enemy is the politics of fear that undergird U.S. immigration law. But as our friend, please know this, that for so many people who face the kinds of civil society restrictions that we just heard about on this panel, this conference is their safe space. The people who you see on this stage speaking and protesting every day are exercising freedoms that they cannot exercise safely at home. What message are you sending to them by forcing them to choose between staying home from this conference and disclosing on their visa application form a drug offense or a crime of moral turpitude, such as sex work? What message are you sending by inviting them to a country whose president has praised Duterte's war on drugs, has allied himself with Putin's Russia, has banned travel from citizens of Venezuela, has failed to challenge governments from Kenya to Hungary? What message are you sending to Tabitha, to Jonas, to Peter, to Ivan, to Alberto? So we say, IAS, please do what these governments do not do. Meet with communities. Hear their voice. Before the week ends, convene an emergency town hall about AIDS 2020. Listen to people's concerns, listen to their hurt, and listen to their proposals. Thank you.